The anatomy of the heart. The heart is located in the mediastinum. The apex or point of the heart rests on the diaphragm, and it lies 2/3 to the left of midline. As you can see in this drawing, the heart is more to the left than the right, and here is one side of the heart resting on the diaphragm. In this cadaver specimen, you can see the lungs and the heart, again with one side resting on the diaphragm. The heart is between the second and fifth rib and lies 2/3 to the left of the midline. If you look at this cross section, you can see how the heart is trapped between the sternum and the vertebra, so that when you compress the chest, you will close the chambers of the heart, and when you release compression, the chambers will fill with blood. The heart muscle looks a little bit like skeletal muscle because it has its myofilaments arranged in sarcomeres, so you see the striations of the heart. Heart muscle is unique in that it is held together by intercalated discs. An intercalated disc is a gap junction and a desmosome. Heart muscle is also branching cells. The pericardium is a fibrous sac that surrounds the heart. It's loose-fitting, but it does make up one of the closed spaces of the body, so it is lined with a serous pericardium. The visceral layer covers the heart, and the parietal layer lines the fibrous sac. The serous pericardium secretes pericardial fluid into the space between the visceral and parietal layers to act as a lubricant so the heart beats with less friction inside the pericardium. The outermost layer of the heart is the epicardium. This is the same as the visceral pericardium. The muscle layer is the myocardium, and the endocardium is the smooth lining of the heart. So if we look at this area of the heart where it's joined to a blood vessel, here is the fibrous pericardium, here is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, and the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. This would be the pericardial cavity where the pericardial fluid would be. Now the visceral layer of the serous pericardium is the same as the epicardium. Here is the myocardium or the muscle layer, and then here is the endocardium. This would be the heart chamber. As we look at the gross anatomy of the heart, the anterior interventricular sulcus is the groove right down the center of the front of the heart. The ligamentum arteriosum is a little ligament that joins the aorta to the pulmonary trunk. In the fetus, this was an open blood vessel that allowed blood from the pulmonary trunk to shunt into the aorta and bypass the lungs. The right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle. The right coronary artery comes directly off the aorta, and it's sort of hidden by this flap of the atrium. It divides into the marginal artery, and then the left coronary artery has the circumflex artery, which goes around to the back of the heart, and the anterior interventricular artery, better known as the left anterior descending artery, or the LAD. If we look at the heart from the back, here you see the opening that's the aorta, and here are the two openings for the vena cava. The pulmonary artery splits immediately into the right and left pulmonary artery, so they go to the lungs, and then there are 4 pulmonary veins that return from the lungs and go into the left atrium. The atrioventricular sulcus is best seen on the posterior of the heart, and it's the groove between the atria and the ventricles. And then down the back of the heart is another groove between the two ventricles called the posterior interventricular sulcus. The great cardiac vein collects the coronary circulation. The middle cardiac vein all drain into the coronary sinus, which empties directly into the right atrium. The posterior interventricular artery is the last branch off of the right coronary artery. It comes down the back. This is known as the posterior descending artery as well. In looking at an actual heart, we can see the right atrium here and the left atrium. Over here is the atrioventricular sulcus between the atria and the ventricles. Here is the right ventricle. Here is the anterior interventricular sulcus, the groove, and here is the left ventricle. If we look at the back of the heart, here is the posterior interventricular sulcus, and here are some of the openings that are the blood vessels. The right atrium here Here's the aorta, and here's the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk's a little bit in front of the aorta. Then the right ventricle, here's the left ventricle. As we look at this cross section, here's the right atrium and the left atrium, and here's the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Here is the interventricular septum, the muscular wall between the ventricles. The right AV valve, or the tricuspid valve, is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The left AV valve, or the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve, is between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The pulmonary semilunar valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve is between the left ventricle and the aorta. The fossa ovalis is a little depression that can be seen on models. It's very hard to see on actual hearts. This is another leftover from the fetal circulation. During the fetal circulation, there was a hole in the septum between the right and left atria. This allowed blood to go from the right atrium straight over to the left atrium and bypass the lungs. This is the leftover scar of that little opening. The chordae tendineae are attached to the valves. They help keep the valves from blowing back in the wrong direction. And the papillary muscles are attached to the chordae tendineae. They contract to help put some pressure on the chordae tendineae to keep the valves in place. The trabecula carnae are these little depressions that we see, and particularly in the ventricles. The trabecula carnae keep the blood from bubbling around. As the blood is forcefully coming through the heart, as it hits here, instead of bubbling and churning around, these channels break it up a little bit and smooth the flow. Here you see a cross section of one of our lab hearts, the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. Now notice the difference in the thickness of the heart muscle on the left side as opposed to the right side. This is not an effect of the way the heart was cut. This is actually a difference. The left ventricle has to pump to the entire body, and so it needs to exert greater force. Here is the interventricular septum. Now the tricuspid valve over here on the right side of the heart, and the bicuspid valve over here. Here are some of those chordae tendineae. Because we have this vessel coming out of the left side of the heart, this is a remnant of the aorta. So this little flap right here is part of the aortic semilunar valve. Here's the tricuspid valve, and here's the bicuspid valve. There's the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles. This is an autopsy specimen, so this is an actual human heart. There are the trabeculae carnae. Looking at the heart from the top, you get a little appreciation for those valves. Here is the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve, and this is the opening for the superior vena cava. The circulation of the blood is based on the heart being a double pump. The right side of the heart pumps the pulmonary circuit. It pumps the blood to the lungs. The blood returns to the left side of the heart, where it is pumped to the systemic circuit, or to the body, and then returns back to the right side of the heart. You need to know the blood flow through the heart. We'll start with the inferior and superior vena cava, returning blood from the body to the right atrium. As blood flows into the right atrium, it will flow through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it will force open the pulmonary semilunar valve, forcing the blood into the pulmonary trunk, which will quickly divide into the right and left pulmonary arteries. The blood will be taken to the capillaries of the lungs so that carbon dioxide can be given up and oxygen can be picked up. Blood will then return to the heart through the pulmonary veins. There are actually 4 of these that empty into the left atrium. Blood will flow through the left atrium and through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, the aortic semilunar valve will be forced open and blood will be forced into the aorta. The aorta branches into all of the arteries of the body, taking blood to all of the organs and to the capillaries of the tissues. Once again, gases are exchanged in the tissues as well as nutrients and waste products. The capillaries drain back into the veins of the body, which come together to make the superior and inferior vena cava, which returns blood to the right side of the heart.